Back live tonight here on In Focus, Border Management Authority Commissioner Dr. Michael Masiapato says the effective management of the South African-Zimbabwe crossing will enhance trade for both economies. It follows a meeting this morning between the two sides to better coordinate the border. Dr. Masiapato joins us now for more on that conversation. Commissioner, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Good evening, Thabo, and thanks for the invitation.
Fairly new body yourself. I know the work to put up the authority has been a long time coming, 15 years to be exact, to get to this point. But you are now essentially acting as the main border control authority in the country. Previously, it was various organs that would have been carrying out that duty. Now we have what the minister calls a one-stop shop that is able to implement all border law enforcement functions across land, air, and maritime ports, entries, and so on and so forth. What did you feel at this particular time? I don't know whether be it by your invitation or by their request, you wanted to host the Zimbabwean counterpart, at least for the next 4 days, for an exercise which they call benchmarking, as they are kind of involved in a similar process.
Yeah, no, thanks, Thabo. I think, firstly, indeed, as the Border Management Authority fairly launched by the President on the 5th of October, so the invitation discussions, or I would say the discussions around what ultimately culminated in this conversation today, and of course proceeding in the week, was on the basis of the engagement that we have had when our President, together with the President of Zimbabwe, interacted at Beit Bridge on the 5th of October. So on that particular basis, we started engaging informally, with the leadership of the Zimbabwean Port Authority. And the issue there was to be able to say the festive period is coming. So on that particular basis, we need to start comparing notes at the highest level in terms of making sure that we are able to, to do better border management better, particularly in the return leg, in as far as the festive period is concerned. So on that basis, we then agreed that we will then have the conversation. So as part of that engagement, the colleagues then indicated that as they are in the journey of establishing what we are launching on the day, they would want to learn some lessons on how we had actually finalized the Border Management Authority, because they are up to this point at the bill level. So they have a bill and it is still to be discussed in their parliament.
Decode for me the statement that you are making. You're saying this particular gathering is firstly to guard mutual interests of both countries to preserve their national imperatives. Well, in simple terms, what are you saying?
So basically what we are saying, Thabo, is that both countries have a common interest. And the common interest is to deal with cross-border crimes of whatever type. Yeah. In this instance, we talk about the movement of illicit goods, for example, from either side, which then continues to compromise either side's economic development, as it were. Yeah. But similarly, we do have a challenge where there is, I would say, high levels of illegal migration, particularly from Zimbabwean side into our side. Yeah. But in that particular process, there are syndicates or there are facilitators who are actually thriving in this particular process by continuing to facilitate illegal migrants, into South Africa. So on that basis, we then agreed that, or maybe you're referring to my opening statement.
Yes.
I then put before them to say it is in both our national interest to make sure that we bring in some element of compliance to the existing legislative frameworks in both countries, for the intention of making sure that we protect each other's national security. But ultimately, we make sure that we do work in protecting each other's national interest. Right. So what basically that means is, one, it is in our interest to see the economies of each country growing, as it were. Mm-hmm. And in this instance, when you have the flooding of illegal goods, for example, in the jurisdiction, it starts to then affect negatively the economics of that particular environment. Yeah. And that is basically what we are talking about. So in there, we are basically saying that it is in our interest to address these issues because it will serve all our national imperatives, as it were.
Yeah. I'm asking that because that was my understanding, to say there needs to be a degree of collective responsibility in how we are managing this border environment. And so, I mean, the recent issue of the 400 or so, 42 buses, where you articulate a particular interpretation of what could have happened, while the Zimbabwean government articulates a different interpretation of what could have happened. You said possible human trafficking. They're saying, no, there can't be human trafficking. Those were just kids going to their parents, right? There seemed to be a particular responsibility that you want to take that they don't seem to want to take.
Yeah, I think if you can really observe that particular, occurrence, as it were, it became a bit unfortunate. Because if you were to observe the statement that came from their Ministry of Social Development, they fairly agreed with us. The only thing they did not agree was the issue of the numbers, which we know is not necessarily an issue. But they indicated that they are working together with the Zimbabwe Republic Police as social development in Zimbabwe to trace the individuals that actually continues to do this heinous crime. And that heinous crime, in their articulation, in their statement, it meant human trafficking. And in this instance, it meant child trafficking, as it were. But at the same time, we do know that there was a subsequent articulation that came from the Ministry of Home Affairs, which basically literally denied everything, which was very much problematic. Yeah. But as the Border Management Authority, we are not necessarily to engage at the ministerial level. Once ministers start to engage, then it shifts into the ministerial level. Operationally, we had dealt with the issues, and unfortunately, there was a challenge that was actually happening at the ministerial level. Yeah. But I can also indicate this point, Thabo, that when we are to have a discussion that seems more academic and intellectual around the concept of trafficking versus smuggling. Yeah. These are very serious issues, as it were, especially when it involves minors. Yeah. Now, somebody will say, somebody who is trafficked is somebody who is being pushed between jurisdictions or otherwise without their consent. And if that is the case, it further indicates if that person is going to be used for nefarious intent out there, whether for child labor or maybe to be used for sexual exploitation and all of that. So if you are to look at that particular definition, especially around the issues of consent, to demonstrate this person is not being coerced, if you have a 5-year-old who is sitting inside the bus and that child has no paper and that child is to cross a border from one jurisdiction to the other, obviously, as a responsible country, there was no way we were going to allow that. But I can assure you, Thabo, that in today's conversation, we have requested them to also come with their colleagues from the social development side. We also came with our colleagues from the social development side to make sure that this aspect is addressed and indeed, the issue has been addressed and it has been settled.
Yeah. So, I want to look at it again in the context of what you're saying today. Part of what needs to happen or is the harmonization, harnessing some kind of harmonization in terms of the border environment. So if we look at least since 2019 from the documents I'm looking at, maybe it can be going a little bit further than that. We've articulated, for example, 7 things that need to accompany a minor who is coming into the country without some authority or parental authority, right? How do you share this information so that your understanding of what needs to be presented and Zimbabwe's understanding of what needs to be presented is harmonized?
You see, Thabo, when you are to look at those particular requirements, they are just not South African. That is why if you look at the document, if you saw that metric, you will realize there that when it comes to the issue of unaccompanied minor, it is something that is understood by various jurisdictions. So it is not just a South African articulation, as it were. That is something that is fairly known and that is something that needs to be observed. The issue here, Thabo, unfortunately, is that we have instances where we had literally relaxed ourselves in as far as these activities are concerned, to the extent that we allowed things that should not have been allowed to actually just continue as if it is normal. Now, As the Border Management Authority, you will remember this point. We do not make rules. We don't make laws. We don't make regulations, policies, and stuff. That is why if you check that document, it is a Home Affairs document. Yeah. And we are responsible for the implementation of those articulations. If there is to be any intention of changing any of those requirements, that is something that must be discussed at the policy level, which is departmental level. Then they will tell us that we have changed the requirements, these are now the new requirements. But as the Border Management Authority, our role is to implement the laws as it stands. And as it stands, those are the laws. And even in this instance, there is no any denial that the children, one, they were unaccompanied, but two, they did not have the requisite documentation. That is why we denied them entry, meaning we did not allow them to even enter the processing area, which is the port of entry. In that manner, we then allow them to go correct the situation. Up to this point, I suppose they are busy correcting that. If indeed those children were being called by their parents, there are many ways to correct it. One way to correct it is for that parent to go pick up their children and make sure the children have the requisite documentation. Our responsibility is to facilitate legitimate movement of persons and goods. We don't do illegitimate facilitation, because once we do that, we ourselves will be arrested for breaking the law.
So it's part of the I suppose, key challenges that your administration is having to deal with, a situation where, one, we became relaxed in terms of our laws, but also there was corruption by some officials. Let's put it very plainly. And they would have facilitated these things, and these things would have happened, and they would have gone unchecked. Do you then sit around the table with your counterpart to say, well, corruption is happening not only on this side, it's also happening on your side. What are you going to be doing on your side to deal with that situation? And do you come up with an agreement?
Yeah, indeed. A part of the conversation was to exactly do that. And you will remember here that the conversation we had was at the highest level. So that is why my counterpart is a retired Lieutenant General. He is the former ambassador. He is Ambassador Dube. So he is sitting at my level on the Zimbabwean side. So the conversation was at that level. So there is no way that either myself or himself would deny the reality on the ground, the issue of corruption. We know that has been the problem. And now we are agreeing that we have been employed in these particular responsibilities to start changing the environment. It is for that reason that we had to sit down and start engaging. So there is that full commitment, Thabo, from the colleagues on the Zimbabwean side, in the same way that there is a commitment from our side to make sure that we do things differently, but more importantly, we address the issue of corruption. Let me give you this practical example, something that we have started doing now, which was not fairly done properly before. Each and every port of entry has what we call the entry point, or it has what we call access gates. So if you were to talk about Beitbridge, for example, there is a south gate, meaning the gate where you enter Beitbridge from the South African side. There is a north gate, meaning the gate that you exit South Africa into Zimbabwe. Now, these gates are supposed to be properly manned, meaning there should be officers in those gates to make sure that everybody who enters the border environment is a legitimate traveler, and that traveler is having all the requisite documentation. The reason why we expose our colleagues into corruption was the fact that our access control has been poor, to the extent that people will then enter into the border environment, go appear before officials, and end up activating bribes and all that. Now, we are now doing things differently by making sure that at the access point, we literally make sure that we do not allow people without requisite document to enter the processing area, meaning to enter the port area. By making sure that we do that, we are already removing that temptation of people to be bribed. So that on its own is something that we've done differently. That is why in this instance, our deployment is now fairly on the north gate, and that is where we did the interception. And that is why we can't talk about people arrested. We talk about people denied entering the South African soil, and therefore we returned them we call that denying them entry, and that is what we did.
Border Management Authority Commissioner Dr. Michael Masiapato talking to us on effective border management, not only just in South Africa, but they are in discussion over the next 4 days with their counterparts in Zimbabwe, where they will be finding some kind of common ground. This is, of course, on the backdrop of those 442 buses that were intercepted with over 400 children. But not only that, the Commissioner of Police in Gauteng saying yesterday the Johannesburg, the Gauteng Police appealing to government rather to expedite the deportation of undocumented people. That's one. But two, he's worried about people who are arrested and they come back into the country. The borders need to be strengthened, he says, because if they come back, they go back where they started, and that becomes a challenge, and that could be one of the reasons why we are seeing a relatively high number of criminal statistics or crime statistics in the country. I don't know on the question of deportation, to what extent were your deliberations on that, and whether even it's something that would be within your purview. But I suppose the issue of the strengthening of the borders certainly would fall within your purview.
Yeah, indeed. Our responsibility as the Border Management Authority, if you were to check the Border Management Authority Act, is all the 72 ports of entries, as you had articulated them, Thabo, as well as what we call the border law enforcement area, which means 10 kilometers from the borderline inland. That is basically the border law enforcement area. Now, in terms of the issue of the internal work, meaning the work inside the country, that particular work is done by a team from the Department of Home Affairs called Immigration Inspectorate. So those are the colleagues who will work inside the country, working together with members of the South African Police Services and the metros and all of the colleagues. If they find people without documentation, they either have to take them to Lindela. When they get them into Lindela, then they will have to take them through a court process, and they deport them once they get a deportation order from a court of law, as it were. And that is basically the work they do. Then our work is exactly what you are saying, is the second part of it. And that is the work to make sure that when people get deported, people no longer walk back into the country, especially if they do not have the requisite documents. And that is now our job. So what we then have done is we are fairly aware of the work that is done internally on the basis of getting the people without documentation to be exited. So our role is to make sure that people don't walk back into the country as they used to do. It is for that reason that in terms of the port of entry, we have deployed in all of the critical areas. I'm not only talking about Beitbridge, but in all of the critical ports, which we know generate a lot of illegal migrants, whether it's Maseru Bridge, Fixback in terms of Lesotho, or Libombo in terms of Mozambique, as well as Beitbridge. So those are our three top ports in terms of generating high numbers of illegal migrants. So what we have done is, one, we have intensified our what we call access control processes from those countries into South Africa to make sure that nobody can enter the port without the documents. Now we know once you do that, then people will then go out of the port into the borderline. It is for that reason that we have now intensified our work with members of the Defence Force to identify what we call vulnerable segments, meaning the areas where we know people will always use to come into the country. In those areas, we then do static deployment, meaning we deploy the border guards in those areas to make sure that people don't enter in there. Once we do that, then it allows the Defence Force to continue with the patrols on the borderline to make sure that we don't allow people to walk into the country illegally.
So this integrated model, this integrated approach, is certainly voluntarily in terms of the various countries. Yes, we have adopted it in South Africa, but how difficult does your job become when you have to interact with countries that do not have this kind of one-stop shop?
Yeah, you see, Thabo, you are right. That is one of the most difficult things. I can give you a typical example. From the 6th to the 9th of November, we visited our colleagues in Mozambique, in Maputo. So obviously, from our side, as the Border Management Authority, we stand integrated, and then we have some of the colleagues that we then go in with. But on the Mozambican side, as an example, we had a delegation of 40 individuals coming from over 7, if not 8, different structures of government. Now, we have to engage with them, and you can understand the complexity, because once you say you are starting to have a decision on this aspect, somebody else raises a hand from another structure that side and start raising issues. When you think you have some bit of a way forward, then the issue of the language becomes another barrier, which is Portuguese versus English. I mean, so the application of a multi-agency approach in as far as border management is concerned has proven over the years that it doesn't work. That is why I sometimes give this example, Thabo, to say, if you apply a multi-agency approach in border environment, as we have been doing, it is more like if you were to apply it at a school, where you will effectively find that when you arrive at a school, you want to say, who is the boss here? And 10 people arrive and say, each one of them saying, I'm the principal. And the other one says, I'm the principal of English here. The other one says, I'm the principal of geography. Somebody says, I'm the principal of biology. If you have a school that is to be run by 10 individuals who stand on their own right, as all of them being equal, automatically you have chaos. But that is what we did for borders. So similarly, if you are to go to a police station, there will be a single station commander. And then the rest of the people will be doing a lot of work below and reporting to the station commander. But you can't have 10 station commanders, one for crime on cars, one for crime on robbery and what, and you think that you can run a police station. So everybody now agrees and understands that the only way we can do this work proper is to do integration. Take these functions, give them under a single authority, allow this authority to go operate on the ground in terms of law enforcement, allow the departments to sit wherever they are in head office and just write policies and write in the laws, and then we do the implementation. So that is why most of the countries are starting to be interested in the model, and therefore we should be able to engage with them, because it makes things easier when we have a single authority for operational decision making.
Commissioner, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming through this evening. That's our Border Management Authority Commissioner, Dr. Masiapato there.